Nothing waited to catch you but your savings, your family, and a charity that ran dry fast. For most of American history, when the paycheck stopped, everything stopped. You might expect the great fight over that hardship to have been a moral one, over whether a wealthy country owed its people a floor. But the argument that built the unemployment check you could collect today was colder and stranger than that. It turned on a single question with almost nothing to do with kindness. Could Washington legally hand you $1 at all? To see how strange that question was, start with a fact that embarrassed a generation of American leaders. The thing itself already existed and had for decades. It existed everywhere except here. Across the Atlantic, in the year 1911, the British Parliament passed the National Insurance Act, and the second part of that law did something no government on earth had tried before. It made insurance against joblessness compulsory. The plan had been pushed inside the Liberal government by the Chancellor of the Exchequer, David Lloyd George, and by a young Winston Churchill who had argued for it years earlier from his post at the Board of Trade. The scheme was deliberately modest. It reached only the boom and bust trades, the men who built houses, the engineers, the workers in the shipyards along the Clyde, roughly 2 million of them in all, and it rested on a simple bargain. The worker paid in a few pennies a week, the employer matched it, and the state added its share on top. 3 contributors, 1 fund, a check when the work dried up. A covered man could draw about 7 shillings a week for up to 15 weeks, no more than that, and if he had been sacked for his own misconduct, he got nothing at all, and the money did nothing for his wife and children. The thing was thin and grudging, but it was compulsory. It was administered to a web of approved societies, and above all, it was running while America was still arguing. Britain had not even been first with the idea. Decades earlier, the Germany of Otto von Bismarck had built insurance against sickness in the 1880s, against workplace accident the year after, and against old age by the end of that decade, a whole scaffolding of social protection erected by a conservative chancellor who wanted to steal the thunder of the rising socialists. His sickness fund alone grew to cover well over 10 million people. So by the 1920s, the model was proven, tested, and paying out across the most industrial nations of Europe. And America looked at every bit of it and said no. That refusal was not laziness or oversight. It was a belief held sincerely and stated proudly. American leaders had a name for the European approach, and they said it with a curl of the lip. They called it the dole. In their telling, a government check for a man out of work was a slow poison. It would rot his self-reliance, soften his character, and turn a nation of strivers into a nation of dependents waiting with an open hand. This was not the view of cranks on the fringe. It sat in the White House. Herbert Hoover believed it to his core, and he was no ordinary skeptic. He had run vast relief operations in Europe after the Great War and fed millions, so he knew precisely what organized aid could do. But he drew a hard line between private charity, which he thought ennobled the giver, and a federal handout, which he thought degraded the receiver. And for 3 long years, as the Depression tightened, he held that line. When the crash came in the autumn of 1929, joblessness stood at something like 3 in every 100 workers. By the depths of 1932, it had climbed to nearly 1 in 4. The scale of it is difficult to take in. A quarter of the men who wanted work could not find any, and the country that watched them stand in the breadline still had no system, none at all, to catch a single one of them. The refusal had become a crisis, and into that crisis, the first crack in the wall opened far from Washington, in a state house on the frozen prairie. The place was Madison, Wisconsin, and the reason it happened there first is a story in itself. For more than a decade, a stubborn economist at the University of Wisconsin named John Commons had been sending versions of the same bill into the state legislature, session after session, watching it die and rewriting it again. Commons was one of the first true labor economists in the country, and he had trained a generation of students who fanned out and kept the fight alive. For most of the 1920s, his measure had a name, the Huber Bill, and it came back to the legislature session after session and lost. What finally turned the vote was an unlikely ally. The farmers of Wisconsin swung behind it, partly because they were frightened that a jobless public would have no money left to buy their crops, and partly because they were furious at rising property taxes levied to fund charity, and they reasoned that if employers would not keep men on, then employers, not farmers, ought to pay for the fallout. Even then, to soothe the businessmen who hated it, La Follette accepted a strange escape clause that would suspend the whole law if voluntary company plans managed to cover 200,000 workers on their own by the middle of 1933, a target the governor privately judged to be meaningless. In the last days of 1931, the legislature passed the measure, and on the 28th of January 1932, Governor Philip La Follette signed it. Wisconsin had just enacted the first unemployment compensation law in the history of the United States, 3 full years before Washington would stir. But the shape of that Wisconsin law matters more than the fact of it, because the argument buried inside it would go on to define the check in your mailbox to this day. Commons and his allies, chief among them the legislator and economist Harold Groves and the administrator Paul Rauschenbusch, did not build their program on the European model of a shared fund. They built it on a very American analogy, the analogy of workman's compensation. The idea was that unemployment, like a workplace injury, was something an employer could be made to prevent. So each company would hold its own separate reserve account, funded by the employer alone, and used to pay only that company's own laid-off workers. There was no pooling of the risk, no common well that everyone drank from. A business that kept its people steadily employed would pay in less. A business that hired and fired with the seasons would pay in more. Under the Wisconsin law, a company handed over 2% of its payroll only until its own reserve account had built up to about $55 per worker, at which point its rate could fall. The whole scheme was an incentive dressed as an insurance program, engineered to make bosses stabilize their own payrolls to lighten their own bill. There is a quiet footnote to that Wisconsin fight worth pausing on. One of the people who helped draft and campaign for the law was Elizabeth Brandeis Rauschenbusch, Paul's wife, and her father was Louis Brandeis, at that very moment a sitting justice of the United States Supreme Court. She and her husband cared so much about the cause that they paid out of their own pockets to fund the public campaign for it. The family of a Supreme Court justice was helping to build the machine whose constitutional fate the court itself would soon decide. The Wisconsin model had a rival, and the contest between the two was a fight over the American soul of the program. Down in Ohio, a different set of reformers led by the insurance thinkers Isaac Rubinow and Abraham Epstein wanted something closer to what Europe had. They proposed a pooled fund, one shared account financed more broadly, paying a larger benefit for a longer stretch. Where the Wisconsin plan offered around $10 a week for perhaps 10 weeks, the Ohio plan reached for $15 a week and 16 weeks of coverage. That was the more generous vision, the more social vision, the one that treated a lost job as a shared misfortune rather than a single company's failure to plan. So here were the two blueprints laid side by side. One was lean, employer-financed, and built to reward the careful boss. The other was pooled, broader, and built to cushion the worker. Whichever philosophy won at the national level would decide for the rest of the century what kind of country this would be when you lost your job. And when the federal government finally moved, it was the Wisconsin design, the stingy one, the employer reserve one, that supplied the blueprint. That single choice is the reason your unemployment insurance is still paid for by employers, still tied to their hiring records, and still varies so wildly the moment you cross a state line. For that federal moment to arrive, though, the country needed a new president and a very particular person standing at his side. And she is the human center of this whole story, so let us give her the weight she is owed. Her name was Frances Perkins, and when Franklin Roosevelt made her his Secretary of Labor, she became the first woman ever to hold a seat in an American president's cabinet. She had not come to the work through theory. As a young woman in New York, on a spring afternoon in 1911, she had been having tea near Washington Square when she heard the screaming and ran toward it. She arrived at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in time to watch young garment workers, trapped behind locked doors on the upper floors, leap from the windows to escape the fire. Nearly 150 of them died that day. Perkins later said that the New Deal itself began, in a sense, on that sidewalk. She spent the rest of her life turning that horror into machinery, into laws and codes and inspections, the unglamorous plumbing of a safer working life. When she took the job under Roosevelt, she took it on a condition, and the condition was a list. She told him plainly what she intended to spend his administration pursuing: a federal minimum wage, a shorter work week, an end to child labor, relief for the states to hand out to the hungry old age pensions, and insurance against the loss of a job. She warned him it was an enormous program and asked whether he truly wanted her to chase all of it, and Roosevelt told her to go ahead. Near the center of that audacious list stood the unemployment check. So in the summer of 1934, Roosevelt created a body called the Committee on Economic Security and put Perkins in charge of it. Her assignment was to design from almost nothing the law that would become the Social Security Act, the law that would carry old age pensions and unemployment, insurance both. She was the one who had to make it real, and make it survive. The making of it nearly broke the committee. They argued to the fall of 1934, proposing and rejecting and circling back. Perkins was the only member who attended every single meeting. And as the year ran down toward its deadline, with the group still splintered and no agreement in sight, she resorted to a tactic that tells you everything about how hard-won this thing was. She gathered the committee at her own home in Georgetown one December night, set a bottle of scotch on the table, and refused to let anyone leave. They stayed until 2 in the morning, when at last, worn down and unwilling to face her again empty-handed, they produced a unanimous report. But that late-night truce solved only the politics. The deepest problem in the room was not political at all. It was constitutional, and it had no obvious answer. Here is the wall they kept slamming into. The Constitution does not hand the federal government a general power to run a welfare state. It grants specific, listed powers, and everything else is reserved to the states. Nowhere in that list does it say Congress may insure a factory worker in Ohio against the loss of his job. Perkins's lawyers stared at that silence all summer and could not get past it. The legal committee deadlocked over the plainest question imaginable. If Washington built this program, under what authority in the Constitution was it standing? And this was no idle worry, because they could see exactly what the Supreme Court of that era did to New Deal laws it disliked. It destroyed them. Within a year, that same court would strike down the National Recovery Administration, the centerpiece of Roosevelt's early program. The case that killed it turned on a Brooklyn poultry business and is remembered to this day as the sick chicken case, and the justices ruled without a single dissent that Congress had seized powers the Constitution never handed it. Soon after, the court gutted the Agricultural Adjustment Act in a case called Butler, throwing out the farm program by a vote of 6-3 and treating the taxes behind it as an invasion of matters reserved to the states. This was a court that treated the reserved powers of the states as a live weapon and swung it hard. Perkins knew that whatever her committee built, it would be dragged before those 9 justices, and that on the record so far, the smart money said they would tear it apart. Her lawyers could see the trap from every angle. Rest the program on the power to regulate commerce between the states, and the court would likely brand a single worker's joblessness a purely local affair beyond Washington's reach. Rest it on a raw power to spend, and the Butler ruling had just shown how quickly that footing gave way. Some of her advisors feared the entire structure, old age pensions and all, could be voided in one stroke before a single benefit was ever paid. She needed a constitutional foundation strong enough to survive all 9 of them. And she found it, of all places, at a dinner party. If this look inside the machinery of how your safety net was actually built is the kind of history you find yourself leaning into, take a second to subscribe, because this channel takes these institutions apart, one hard-won law at a time. Now let us go to the tea party that changed the shape of American life. It happened on an ordinary Wednesday evening. Perkins had little natural fondness for Washington's social rounds, yet she went that night to the home of Justice Harlan Fiske Stone, a member of the very court she feared. At some point in the gathering, she found herself seated beside Stone, and in the small talk he asked her kindly how her work was coming along. She could have deflected. Instead, she seized the moment and told him the truth. She said they were stuck, that they could not find solid constitutional ground under this new program, that they did not know what a wise and lawful method would even look like. What Stone did next, he did with care. A sitting justice cannot openly advise the government on a law he may later have to judge, and he knew it, so he glanced around the room to see whether anyone was listening. Then he raised his hand to the side of his mouth, leaned toward her, and said in an ear whisper, "The taxing power, my dear, the taxing power." That was all of it. He was telling her where the door was. Congress might have no general power to run an insurance program, but Congress has an enormous, long-settled power to lay and collect taxes. Build the thing on taxation, and you build it on bedrock the court had defended for a century. Perkins understood at once. She went back to her committee and told them she had made up her mind that the program would rest on the taxing power and nothing else. Never once did she tell them how she had come by the certainty. She let them believe she had arrived at it on her own, as if the answer had come to her out of thin air. In truth, it had come from a whispered tip at a tea party, from a judge quietly showing the executive branch how to write a law he might one day have to bless from the bench. And the design that grew out of that whisper is why your unemployment coverage became the strange contraption it remains, because you cannot merely tax people and call the result insurance. The device, Perkins's lawyers reverse-engineered, was more cunning than that, and to appreciate it, you have to see the old trick it was copied from. Years earlier, Congress had wanted the states to levy estate taxes but could not order them to. So it had built a clever lever into the federal estate tax. It taxed large estates nationwide, then offered a credit worth up to most of that federal bill to anyone who had paid a matching estate tax to their own state. Overnight, refusing to enact a state estate tax became pointless. The money would leave your citizens' pockets either way, so a state might as well collect its own share rather than surrender it all to Washington. The Supreme Court had looked at that maneuver in a case called Florida versus Mellon and let it stand, and that precedent had pushed the great majority of states to fall obediently into line. Perkins' team took that estate tax lever and rebuilt it for unemployment. The Social Security Act, which Roosevelt signed on the 14th of August 1935, laid a new federal tax on the payrolls of employers across the country, but it paired that tax with a credit. Any employer who paid into an approved state unemployment fund could subtract up to 90% of the federal tax he owed, tax everyone, then hand nearly all of it back to any state that agreed to build a qualifying program of its own. The federal levy started small and climbed by design, 1% of payroll in the first year, then 2, then 3. On paper, it left the states perfectly free to choose. In practice, it left them no choice at all, because a state that refused to build a program would watch its employers pay the full federal tax and get nothing back. It was coercion wearing the costume of a free decision. And that costume was the entire point, because it was what might survive the court. Might. Because the gamble was not over when the ink dried. It had only moved to a courtroom. The test case arrived carrying an almost comically small sum. An Alabama company called the Steward Machine Company had paid its new federal unemployment tax a grand total of $46.14 before suing to get every penny of it back, arguing the whole scheme was unconstitutional. The company's lawyers made exactly the argument Perkins had feared for 2 years. They said the tax was a fraud, a club, that its real aim was to whip the state legislatures into passing unemployment laws at Washington's command, and that this trampled the powers the Constitution reserved to the states. The court had leaned on that very reasoning to strike down the farm program. If it worked here, American unemployment insurance would die in its cradle. The decision came down on the 24th of May, 1937, in the case of Steward Machine Company versus Davis, and it came down by the narrowest margin the court can produce, 5 votes to 4. Justice Benjamin Cardozo wrote for that bare majority, and to justify the tax and credit device, he leaned on the very precedent Perkins's team had copied, the estate tax logic of Florida versus Mellon. If that lever was legitimate for estates, Cardozo reasoned, it was legitimate here. The pressure on the states was real, he acknowledged, but it was inducement, not compulsion, and inducement was allowed. 4 justices disagreed and would have struck the program down. Among them the old conservatives James McReynolds and George Sutherland, who insisted that the 10th Amendment forbade Washington from hurting the states with exactly this kind of financial whip. What tipped the balance the other way was partly the moment itself. By that term, the court had begun a broad retreat from its war on the New Deal, worn down by the crushing scale of the Depression and by Roosevelt's open threat to enlarge the bench with justices of his own choosing, a pressure the era would remember long after. The result, even so, was as thin as paper. Move 1 vote from the majority to the dissent, 1 justice out of 9, and there is no federal unemployment insurance in America. The entire system you now take for granted hangs in its founding on a single-robed shoulder, so it survived. But survival came at a price that was written directly into the law, and an honest telling has to close the ledger on both sides. The compromises that got the bill through Congress are the same compromises that hobbled it, and some of them are ugly. To pass anything, Roosevelt needed the Southern Democrats who ran the key committees of Congress, and those men had a condition. The new law could not be allowed to reach the workers who filled the fields and the kitchens of the South. So the statute, in the fine print of Title IX, flatly defined agricultural labor and domestic service out of the program. If you picked cotton or cooked and cleaned in another family's house, the law did not cover you by its own explicit terms. That exclusion carved out most of the black workforce of the entire country, and it did so on purpose in the text of the act itself. The floor that Francis Perkins built was real, but a great many Americans were left standing beneath it. The second compromise was the one that dodged the court, and it shaped the map you live on now. To calm the states' rights objections and to keep the design on safe constitutional ground, Congress left the actual benefits, how much you get and for how many weeks, entirely up to each individual state. The Wisconsin DNA at the program's core, that employer-financed, keep your taxes low instinct, gave every state a permanent reason to stay stingy. The original design guaranteed as much. An employer's own tax rate rises when his former workers draw benefits, a mechanism called experience rating, so every company carries a built-in reason to resist generous payments and even to contest the claims of the very people it laid off. Layer onto that the pressure of states competing to keep their business taxes lower than the state next door, and the program is left racing decade after decade toward the floor rather than the ceiling. The result is the patchwork that persists to this day. In most states, the check replaces only something like 2/5 to 1/2 of the wage you lost, and it runs for only a dozen to 16 weeks, and at the very start, the whole system reached only about half the working population. Your protection depends on which side of a state line you happen to live on. And yet, set against everything it failed to do, the thing it did do had never existed here before. For the first time in the nation's history, there was a floor, a real one. A system that put money in the hands of a laid-off worker as a matter of right, rather than charity. The very first such check in the whole country had gone out a little earlier from Wisconsin, on a summer day in 1936, made out for $15 to a man named Niels Rude. He suspected the slip of paper was worth more than its face, and he was right. He sold the check itself to Paul Rauschenbusch, one of the men who had helped write the law, for well above its value, and it survives in a historical collection to this day. That floor turned out to be more than a comfort to individuals. It became an automatic brace under the whole economy. When a downturn hits and millions stop spending, those unemployment checks keep a trickle of money moving through the shops and the towns, softening the fall. In the recession of 1958, in the hard years of the 1980s, in the crash of 2008, in the sudden shutdown of 2020, that quiet mechanism did its work. And none of those downturns ever plunged the country back to the 1-in-4 catastrophe of 1932. The stingy little compromise turned out to be load-bearing. So think of the worker being laid off somewhere in America this week. She will file a claim and collect a fraction of her old wage for a few short months, in a program that looks nothing like the one her neighbor would get just across the state line. Her benefit was never built from first principles for a just society. She is living inside a compromise, struck at a Georgetown Tea Party in the winter of 1934, funneled through a whispered tip about the taxing power, and ratified by one Supreme Court vote in the spring of 1937. And the old suspicion the designers had to tiptoe around, the belief that a check for the jobless breeds laziness, never died with them. It comes back in every recession, in every fight over whether the benefits have grown too generous, the same argument in a new suit of clothes. That is the honest shape of it. What America built when it finally caught its fallen was not a safety net woven from conviction, but a tax loophole bent into the rough shape of mercy, then asked to bear the weight of everyone who ever falls. If you found this worth your time, stay with the channel, because the systems you lean on every day almost all began exactly like this one. In a fight nobody remembers, decided by a margin nobody would believe.